Everyone told you time heals, and you believed them because what else were you going to do? So you waited. You got through the first week, the first month, the brutal stretch where everything reminded you of them and the absence had a physical weight to it. You did the work, you kept going, and somewhere in that process you assumed the time was doing the same thing to them that it was doing to you, softening things, creating distance, making the whole thing smaller and more manageable. It wasn't. Time does not work on an avoidant the way it works on most people. And understanding exactly what it does instead, what happens inside someone with avoidant attachment as the days and weeks and months stack up without you, is going to reframe this entire experience in a way that nothing else has managed to yet. Because here is what nobody tells you. The avoidant who left, who pulled back, who created the distance and then maintained it with everything they had, that person did not get relief when you stopped being in front of them. They got a temporary reduction in anxiety, and those are not the same thing, not even close. The anxiety reduction felt like the right call. It always does at first. The pressure lifts. The closeness that was triggering all the alarm responses in their nervous system is no longer immediate. They can breathe again. They can feel like themselves again. The managed, self-sufficient, not visibly needing version of themselves that their whole psychology was constructed to maintain. And for a window of time, sometimes a significant window, that feels like freedom. But underneath that feeling of freedom, something else is happening. Something slow and relentless and completely outside their control. What the avoidance system does not tell them, the avoidance defense system is extraordinarily good at one specific thing: managing the present, regulating immediate emotional experience, keeping the feeling at a distance that is survivable. It was built for exactly that purpose, and it has had decades of practice, and it is, in the short term, remarkably effective. What it is not good at, what it was never designed to handle, is the accumulation of absence over time. Because absence is not an immediate emotional event. It does not arrive with the intensity of a difficult conversation or the pressure of someone asking for more than they can give. It arrives quietly, in increments, in the spaces between things, and the avoidance defense system, which is calibrated to respond to direct emotional threat, does not have a clean protocol for something that seeps rather than strikes. So it seeps. The absence of you seeps into the life they have constructed around not needing, into the routines that used to have you in them, into the quiet moments that their system is less equipped to manage than the loud ones, into the nights, which you already know about, into the random, unpredictable ambushes of memory that do not ask permission before they arrive and do not respond to the usual management techniques. And here is the part that matters most. The longer the absence continues, the more the seeping accumulates. Time does not dilute it for an avoidant the way conventional wisdom suggests it should. Time intensifies it, because every day that passes without you is another day of data that the defended part of them cannot indefinitely ignore. Another day that adds its weight to the growing undeniable evidence that something real is gone, something that mattered, something that their system worked very hard to push away and is now, in the quiet aftermath of having succeeded, beginning to reckon with. The relief of the early separation gives way to something they were not prepared for, and what they were not prepared for is the thing that is going to reframe everything you have been telling yourself about what the silence means. The myth of the avoidant who moves on clean. There is a story that gets told about avoidance after a separation. It goes like this. They walked away easily. They seem fine. They have not reached out. They have not shown any visible signs of struggle. Therefore, they did not care as much as you did. Therefore, the connection was asymmetrical. Therefore, you are the one left holding the grief while they move through their life unburdened and unaffected. That story is wrong. Not in every detail. Some of the surface observations are accurate. They do appear fine. They have not reached out. The visible signs of struggle are largely absent. All of that can be true simultaneously with everything that follows. The avoidant does not move on clean. They move on defended. And defended is not the same as healed. Defended is not the same as over it. Defended is a person who has taken the feeling and put it somewhere that is not visible to the outside world, including, critically, not fully visible to themselves, and continued functioning while that feeling sits in its contained space and grows heavier with every passing week. The reason they appear fine is not because they are fine. It is because appearing fine is the skill they have spent their entire life developing to the highest possible level. It is their most practiced performance. It is what they do. It does not tell you anything reliable about what is actually happening in the interior that the performance is designed to conceal. What is actually happening in that interior? And this builds over time in a way that is specific to avoidant attachment and important to understand, is a process that psychologists sometimes describe as the return of the suppressed. The feelings that were successfully pushed down in the immediate aftermath of the separation do not stay down. They cannot. Suppression is not elimination, it is postponement. And what gets postponed does not get smaller in storage. It gets larger, more insistent, more difficult to manage the longer it goes unaddressed. The specific way time turns on them. In the first weeks after a separation, the avoidance system is running the program it always runs. Relief, distance, self-sufficiency, the activation of the identity that exists independently of connection. This is comfortable territory. This is home base. The nervous system settles. The anxiety that proximity to real intimacy produces, gone. The pressure of someone's needs and emotions and presence, gone. This is what they wanted. This is what they engineered. And then something shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way they can easily point to, but somewhere around the point where the initial relief is fully landed and the distraction of the transition has worn off, the system starts receiving information it does not have a prepared response to. The information is this. The thing they pushed away was not just pressure. It was not just anxiety producing closeness and emotional demand and the terrifying vulnerability of being needed and needing in return. It was also warmth. It was also the specific, irreplaceable texture of another person who knew them, who got through, who represented something their defended life does not otherwise contain. And that warmth, its absence, starts to register, not as emergency, not as the acute, alarm-triggering intensity of the intimacy that made them run, but as a low, persistent, increasingly undeniable absence of something that the defended life cannot replace. Because here is the truth about the life and avoidant constructs around not needing. It is functional. It is often successful by external measures. It is sustainable in the way that a very controlled, carefully managed environment is sustainable. But it is not full. It does not have the thing that you brought to it, the thing that made them feel, in those unguarded moments, like the walls were actually optional rather than load-bearing. Time removes the noise of the transition and leaves them in the quiet. And the quiet contains the absence, and the absence has a specific shape, your shape. And the longer they sit in that quiet, the longer the defended life hums along in its competent, self-sufficient, emotionally controlled way, the more audible that absence becomes. What happens inside them at the 6-week mark, the 3-month mark, the 6-month mark? Not exact, not universal, but patterned enough to be worth walking through. In the early weeks, the dominant experience is relief mixed with the low-level guilt that most avoidants carry about the impact of their patterns on people they care about. The guilt is manageable. It gets filed alongside the story that this was the right call, that they need their space, that the relationship was too intense or too complicated or too demanding. The story does the work of keeping the guilt contained. By the 6-week mark, for most avoidants, the relief is no longer the loudest thing. What starts to surface is something quieter and more destabilizing, the first real encounters with missing. Not the nighttime missing that was always there, the daytime missing, the kind that ambushes them in ordinary moments. A song, a place, something that happens they would have told you about. Something funny that lands differently because there is nobody to share it with who would have understood it the way you did. These moments get managed, pushed down, recontextualized. but they start occurring with a frequency that the management system has to work increasingly hard to keep up with. By the 3-month mark, something more significant has usually shifted. The constructed story, the one that justified the distance, that made the leaving feel logical and necessary, starts developing cracks because stories require maintenance. They require the person to keep not examining the parts that don't fully hold up. And 3 months of quiet, 3 months of absence, 3 months of the defended life proceeding without the thing it pushed away, that is enough time for the cracks to become visible. The avoidant at 3 months is often in a state of low-grade internal conflict that they are not fully acknowledging to themselves. The defense system is still operational. The walls are still up, but the confidence with which the walls were originally erected, the certainty that this was right, that distance was necessary, that the feeling was manageable, that confidence has softened quietly in ways they might not even consciously register yet. By 6 months, for an avoidant who has not actively sought out therapy or done significant internal work, the suppressed material has usually reached a volume that the ordinary management techniques are struggling to contain. The missing is no longer occasional ambushes. It is a persistent background presence. The story that justified everything requires increasingly creative maintenance, and something new has entered the picture. Regret. Not necessarily acted upon, not necessarily even fully acknowledged, but present, real, sitting in the defended interior with a weight that the earlier months did not have. This is the arc. This is what time does to an avoidant, specifically when the person they pushed away was someone who genuinely got through. Not relief that compounds, not distance that becomes comfortable and permanent. A reckoning that builds, slowly, relentlessly, underneath the surface that looks from the outside like someone who has simply moved on. Why this matters for where you are right now. If you are in the early days of this, if the separation is raw and the silence is new, and every hour feels like evidence that you never mattered, this is what is happening on the other side of that silence. Not indifference, the construction of a defense against something real, the managed retreat of a person who felt too much and had no tools to stay with the feeling. The silence is not emptiness, it is a wall, and walls are built around things worth protecting from. The absence of contact is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of fear, doing what fear has always done in this person, keeping them from the thing they most need by convincing them it is the thing most dangerous. If you are further along, if it has been months, if the rawness has given way to a dull, persistent ache, if you have moved through the worst of it and arrived somewhere that is functional but not yet full, then what you need to understand is this. The arc we just walked through, they are on it too, just silently, just invisibly, just in the defended interior that the outside world, including you, does not have access to. Time is not working in the direction you assumed. It is not creating comfortable distance for them while you do the hard work of healing. It is accumulating, building, quietly dismantling the story that made the leaving feel justified. And what emerges from that dismantling, whether it becomes action, whether it becomes the courage to finally close the distance they created, that is the conversation that comes next. Because understanding what time does to them is only the first part. What you do with that understanding, how you position yourself, how you relate to your own healing, what you are building in the silence while their reckoning builds in theirs, that is where this gets real. And that is exactly where we are going. So time is doing its work on them, quietly, relentlessly, in the defended interior they have spent years learning to maintain. The reckoning is building. The story is cracking. The absence of you is becoming something their system cannot indefinitely file away and ignore. And now you need to hear something that is going to be uncomfortable, because there is a very specific way that people take this information and use it in a way that sets them back significantly. That delays their own healing. That keeps them in a suspended state that feels like strategy but functions like a trap. They take the knowledge that time is working on the avoidant and they use it as a reason to wait better, to be more patient, to stay available in a more disciplined, more strategic, more psychologically informed way. They think, okay, the reckoning is coming. I just need to be in the right position when it arrives. I need to be healed enough to look good, but not so healed that I've actually moved on. I need to be present enough to be reachable, but not so present that I'm chasing. I need to manage this whole thing just right so that when they finally come around, I am exactly where I need to be. That is not healing. That is a full-time job with no salary and no guarantee of employment, and it will consume you if you let it. The difference between healing and positioning, these two things feel identical from the inside. That is the problem. When you are genuinely healing, rebuilding your life, reinvesting in yourself, creating forward momentum that has nothing to do with them, you also happen to be doing exactly what would make you most attractive to an avoidant who is beginning their reckoning. The behaviors overlap completely. The outcomes look the same from the outside, but the internal experience is entirely different. And the internal experience is what determines whether what you are doing is actually working, or whether you are running on a treadmill that feels like progress. Genuine healing is not oriented toward them. It does not have a back channel running in the background that is constantly assessing everything you do in terms of how it might land when they eventually resurface. It does not involve keeping one eye on your own growth and one eye on the horizon, waiting for them to appear. It is simply, and the simplicity is harder than it sounds, living your life in the direction of what is actually good for you, because it is good for you, full stop. Positioning looks identical on the surface. You are also doing things, also moving forward, also investing in yourself and your life and your well-being. But underneath all of it is a calculation, a quiet, persistent, exhausting calculation about whether this is enough, whether they can see it somehow, whether you are healing at the right pace and in the right direction to be in the optimal position when the reckoning delivers them back to you. The calculation is what kills it, not because it makes the healing fake. The things you do are real regardless of the motivation behind them, but because the calculation keeps you emotionally tethered. It keeps part of your nervous system permanently allocated to them, to the relationship, to the outcome. And that allocation has a cost. It costs you the full experience of your own life. It costs you the genuine, untethered investment in your own direction. That is the only thing that produces real change in how you feel. And here is the practical consequence of that cost. The healing that happens while you are positioning is incomplete. It goes so far and then it stops. Because going further would mean genuinely releasing the outcome. And releasing the outcome feels, when you are positioning, like abandoning the strategy, like giving up the advantage, like arriving too healed to still want them back if they do eventually come. So you stay in the middle, functional but not free, moving but not forward. And the months pass, and the avoidance reckoning builds, and you are right where you were, except more tired and more sophisticated in your understanding of why you are stuck. What the avoidance reckoning actually produces. Let's talk about what happens when the crack in their story becomes a fracture, when the 6-month mark hits, or the 8-month mark, or whenever the accumulated weight of the absence finally becomes something they cannot manage with the usual tools. What does that actually look like? What does it produce in them? Because the answer is not what most people hope it will be. And getting clear on this now saves significant pain later. The reckoning does not automatically produce action. This is the part that tends to devastate people who have been waiting for it. The internal shift, the growing regret, the crumbling justification, the undeniable missing. None of that translates automatically into reaching out, into closing the distance, into being ready for the relationship in a way they weren't before. Because the same defense system that made them run in the first place is still operational. It does not dismantle itself just because the feeling it was protecting against has grown louder. If anything, the louder the feeling gets, the harder the defense system works to contain it. The regret arrives, and the defense system immediately begins constructing reasons why acting on the regret would be a mistake. The missing intensifies, and the defense system produces a fresh round of devaluation. Maybe it wasn't as good as I'm remembering. Maybe the problems were real. Maybe reaching out would just restart something that ended for good reasons. The defense system is not stupid. It has been doing this for decades. It knows every move, and it will use the vulnerability of the reckoning as further evidence that feeling this much about someone is dangerous and should be avoided rather than acted upon. So what the reckoning actually produces is not a clean return, not a phone call, not a message that says everything you have been waiting to hear. What it produces first is internal turbulence, a period of genuine conflict between the part that feels and the part that defends, a back and forth that the avoidant may not fully understand themselves and almost certainly will not narrate to you in real time. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, after enough of that turbulence, after enough rounds of the defense system working overtime against the growing weight of the feeling, something gives. A small thing first, a message that seems casual but is not casual, a reason to be in contact that has enough plausible deniability to clear the bar the defense system requires, a toe in the water that is actually the reckoning looking for a way out of the interior and into the open. You need to know what that looks like so you do not miss it. But more importantly, you need to know what to do with it when it arrives. Because how you respond in that moment determines everything about whether the reckoning becomes something real or retreats back into the defended interior and stays there. The re-entry, what it looks like and what it means. When an avoidant who has been through a genuine reckoning begins to move back towards you, it will almost never look like what you imagined. There will be no grand gesture, no declaration, no moment where they lay everything out and say, I understand what I did and I am ready to do it differently, and here is my evidence. It will look small, deliberately small, because small is all the defense system will authorize. Small carries the least exposure. Small can be walked back if the vulnerability becomes too threatening. Small is the only size of opening that the defended person can make without triggering the full alarm response that made them run in the first place. A message about something mundane that you both had a connection to. A response to something tangential. A question that does not directly address anything real, but which requires contact to ask. Something that, standing alone, could be read as nothing, but which, in the context of everything you know about this person and this dynamic and what time has been doing to them, is not nothing, is in fact the reckoning finding the smallest possible door and using it. What you do in that moment is not reach back with everything you have been holding, not flood the opening with the accumulated feeling of however many months it has been, not immediately try to have the conversation that resolves everything or confirms everything or closes the loop on all the unfinished business. What you do is match the smallness. You respond at the same temperature. You keep it as light as they kept it. You open the door a little rather than swinging it wide, because the defense system is watching. It is watching your response for evidence that this was a mistake, for signs of the pressure and the intensity and the emotional demand that it spent all this time convincing them was why the distance was necessary. If your response confirms that story, if it carries the weight of everything unsaid, if it is warm in a way that is overwhelming rather than simply present, the defense system will use that confirmation to shut the opening back down. The small door closes, and reopening it requires the whole reckoning to build again from somewhere further back. Matching the smallness is not playing games. It is not strategy in the calculating sense. It is the emotionally intelligent recognition that this person's system can only handle a certain volume of feeling at a given time, and that the way to create space for more is to start with less, to let them lead the pace, to be genuinely present without being overwhelming, to communicate through the quality of your response rather than its content. That being close to you is safe. That you have not been sitting in the accumulation of everything they left you with, waiting to pour it all back on them the moment they reappeared. But here is the harder truth. All of that, everything just described about the reckoning and the re-entry and the smallness and how to respond, all of it assumes something that is worth stating plainly before you build anything on top of it. It assumes you still want this, not the idea of it, Not the relief of resolution, not the validation of being chosen by someone who previously could not choose you, but the actual, present tense reality of this specific person, with all of their patterns and limitations, and the specific ways their avoidance has expressed itself in your direction, because there is a version of wanting them back that is really wanting the pain to have meant something, wanting the investment to have been worth it, wanting the story to have a redemptive ending, because the alternative, that you spend all this time and feeling on something that simply did not work out, is too bleak to fully accept. That is not a reason to go back. That is grief looking for a shortcut. The real question, the one worth sitting with honestly before the re-entry happens, while you still have the clarity of distance, is whether what you know about this person, about their capacity as it currently stands, about the consistency of their patterns over time, about what they have and have not shown you about their willingness to do the internal work, whether all of that adds up to something you would genuinely freely choose. Not because you have no other options, not because the history is too significant to walk away from, not because the connection was rare and real and you are afraid of not finding that again, but because when you look at this person clearly and completely, what they offer, not what they might offer, not what the best version of them offered in the best moments, but what is consistently, reliably available is something that genuinely meets you where you are. If the answer is yes, then the reckoning matters. Then the re-entry is something to navigate with care and presence and the emotional intelligence this whole experience has been building in you. If the answer is no, if the honest answer, underneath the hope and the history and the pull of the familiar, is that what is actually available is not enough, then the reckoning is still happening in them. The time is still doing its work, the feeling is still real, and none of that changes what you need to do, which is continue building the life that does not require their arrival to be complete. Both answers are valid. Both require honesty that is harder than understanding someone else's attachment style. Both require you to look at yourself, at what you actually need, at what you have actually been settling for, at what you would choose if fear were not one of the available options. What you are building in the silence, while their reckoning builds in the defended interior, something is being built on your side too. Whether you are conscious of it or not, whether you are directing it or just surviving it. Every day that you spend genuinely invested in your own life, not performing investment, not positioning, but actually present in the direction of what is good and true and expanding for you, you are building something that has nothing to do with them and everything to do with who you are becoming. That becoming is the real work, not the understanding of their psychology, not the navigation of the re-entry if and when it comes, not the management of the waiting or the grief or the hope. The real work is the slow, daily, undramatic process of becoming someone whose life is genuinely full enough that another person's unavailability, however painful, does not constitute an emergency. That fullness is not about replacing them. It is not about filling the space they left with enough activity that you stop noticing the space. It is about building a relationship with your own life that is primary, that does not require external validation to feel real. That generates its own forward momentum, independent of whether anyone is watching or returning or choosing you. That version of you, the one who has built that, is someone the avoidance reckoning, if it produces action, will encounter and not recognize. Not because you have changed your personality or your values or the quality of feeling you bring to connection, but because the anxiety is gone, the orbiting is gone, the subtle, constant, exhausting posture of someone waiting to be chosen is gone, and in its place is someone who is simply, fully, unambiguously living. That is what time, used correctly, builds on your side. Not just healing, not just recovery, a genuine, expanded, forward-facing version of yourself that is the natural product of having gone through something this difficult and refused to let it make you smaller. That is what you are building right now, even on the days when it does not feel like building, even on the days when it feels like just getting through. The building is happening, the becoming is happening, and whatever the avoidance reckoning eventually delivers, or does not deliver, that version of you will be ready. not ready for them specifically, ready for whatever is actually meant for you, which it turns out is the only kind of ready worth being. Here is what nobody prepares you for. The moment the avoidant actually comes back, not hypothetically, not in the fantasy you have rehearsed 100 times, but actually in real life, with a real message or a real call or a real appearance in your life after all the silence. Your nervous system does not do what you thought it would do. You thought you would feel relief, vindication, the clean, satisfying resolution of something that has been unfinished for too long. You thought you would know exactly what to say because you have had the conversation in your head so many times that it feels like something that already happened. What you actually feel is destabilized, uncertain in a way that catches you completely off guard, because the version of you that is receiving this contact is not the same version that they left. And the situation is not the clean, resolved, emotionally tidy thing the fantasy version was. It is messy and loaded and threaded through with everything that happened in the silence. And the first thing you need to understand is that destabilization is not a sign that you are not healed enough. It is a sign that this is real. Real things destabilize. Fantasies don't. So let's talk about what you actually do with real. The first mistake people make when the avoidant returns. The first mistake is moving at the speed of the relief rather than the speed of the reality. The relief wants to close the gap immediately, wants to get back to the warmth, the closeness, the version of the connection that existed before everything fell apart. The relief has been waiting a long time, and it is not interested in being patient now that the waiting appears to be over. It wants to skip straight to the part where everything is resolved, and the pain was worth it, and the story has the ending it was supposed to have. And so people move fast. They re-establish intimacy before they have re-established trust. They return to the emotional depth of where things were without examining whether anything has actually changed that would make that depth sustainable this time. They treat the return as the resolution rather than as the beginning of the real conversation. The one about what happened, what has shifted, what is different now, and what both people are actually willing and able to bring. Moving at the speed of relief is understandable. It is also how people end up back in the exact same cycle 3 months later, more confused and more depleted than they were the first time around. Because the return, by itself, does not fix anything. The return is just the avoidance reckoning finding its way out of the interior. It is not evidence that the patterns have changed. It is not a guarantee that the intimacy will be handled differently. It is a door opening. What happens after the door opens depends entirely on what both people bring to the threshold. What you bring matters as much as what they bring. And what you bring needs to come from the version of you that was built in the silence, not the version that was present before the separation, not the version organized around hope and relief, but the one that did the actual work, the one that knows what it needs, the one that is not willing to re-enter the old dynamic just because the alternative was painful. What actually changed and what didn't? This requires honesty that the relief will actively resist, because the relief wants everything to have changed, wants the reckoning to have been a complete transformation, wants to believe that the person returning is fundamentally different from the person who left. Some things may have changed. Time and absence and the weight of the reckoning do produce real internal movement in avoidance who have enough self-awareness to feel what is happening in them. The crack in the story becomes a genuine reassessment. The suppressed feeling, once it reaches a volume that cannot be managed, sometimes forces a level of self-confrontation that was previously unavailable. Some avoidants in the silence find their way to therapy, to honest self-examination, to a real reckoning with the patterns that have cost them the things they actually valued. That change is real when it is real, and it shows up in specific observable ways, not in declarations. Declarations are cheap and the defense system produces them easily when it needs to clear a bar. In behavior, in the quality of presence they bring when they return, in whether they can stay in a difficult conversation rather than deflecting, in whether they can acknowledge what happened without immediately reframing it into something more comfortable for them, in whether the smallness of the re-entry gives way over time and with consistency, to something more substantial. What does not change automatically, without real work on their part, is the underlying architecture. The nervous system that reads intimacy as threat, the deactivating strategies that fire when closeness reaches a certain threshold, the deeply embedded belief that needing someone means being at their mercy in a way that is not survivable. Those things do not change because they missed you. They do not change because the reckoning was painful. They change through sustained, deliberate, often professionally supported effort to rewire responses that have been running since before they had conscious access to them. So the question when they return is not, do they still have feelings? They do. The question is not even, did they miss me? They did. The question is, what have they done with the time? What has the reckoning produced beyond the return itself? What evidence exists, not in what they say, but in how they show up, that the thing you need from them is now something they are capable of giving? Evidence over time, not declarations in the moment. Evidence over time is the only reliable currency in this specific situation. How to hold yourself in the re-entry. You are going to want to make it easy for them. This is the pull you will feel most strongly, and it is the one that requires the most conscious attention, because making it easy, removing friction, absorbing discomfort, managing your own needs carefully so as not to trigger the retreat again, is the pattern that got you here. It is the thing you know how to do. It is familiar, and it feels like love, and it is, in this specific dynamic, one of the ways you have historically made yourself smaller to fit into the space their avoidance allowed. Do not do that, not because you should be difficult, not because withholding warmth is somehow strategic or protective, but because the version of you that shrinks to accommodate their comfort is not the version of you that this relationship needs if it is going to be different this time. It is not the version of you that you spent all that silence building. Hold yourself in the re-entry. Be warm but not consuming. Be present but not organized around their comfort. Be honest about what you need, not in a flooding, overwhelming way, not with the accumulated weight of everything from before, but in the simple, clean, present tense way of someone who knows themselves and takes that knowledge seriously. If something feels off, say so, quietly, without drama, without the full history attached. Just, this doesn't feel right to me, and here is why, simply stated. If the pace feels too fast, slow it down, not as punishment, not as a test, because the pace that works for the relief is not necessarily the pace that works for building something real. If you need something from them that they are not providing, name it once, clearly, without over-explaining, and then watch what they do with it, because what they do with a simply stated need, whether they can receive it without retreating, whether they can respond to it without deflecting, whether it triggers the old pattern, or whether something genuinely different is available now, that is your most reliable information about what has changed. You are not an audition anymore. You are not calibrating yourself to pass a test whose criteria keep shifting. You are a person who knows what love is supposed to feel like and is no longer willing to accept a version that requires you to constantly manage yourself around someone else's limitations. That is the stance, not hostile, not withholding, just real, just grounded, just fully unapologetically yourself. The version of this that does not involve them coming back, because it needs to be said, because not every reckoning produces a return, because some avoidants feel the full weight of the accumulating absence and the crumbling story and the regret that builds in the silence, and still do not come back, still cannot clear the bar their defense system requires, still choose the safety of the defended life over the risk of reopening something that costs them the sense of control they organize themselves around. That is a real outcome. It is not the one you have been hoping for, but it is real and it deserves to be looked at directly, rather than treated as the unthinkable alternative that motivates the waiting without ever being honestly examined. If they do not come back, if the reckoning stays internal, if the return never materializes, if the silence extends beyond the point where any reasonable reading of the situation could call it temporary, then what time has been building on your side is not preparation for a re-entry that isn't coming. It is the life itself the actual, present, ongoing life that was being built in the silence. And the question shifts from what do I do when they return to what have I actually built while I was waiting. The answer to that question, what you have built, who you have become, how the silence was used, that is what determines whether this experience made you or cost you. Not whether they came back, not whether the reckoning produced action, not whether the investment was ultimately returned. You. What happened to you in the silence? That is the only outcome you ever had full control over, and it is the only one that definitively matters regardless of what they do or do not do. What time actually was, here is the reframe that everything has been building toward, and it requires you to hold two things at once that feel contradictory but are actually both true. Time was working on them. The reckoning is real. The accumulating absence, the crumbling story, the growing weight of what they pushed away, all of it is happening in them whether or not it produces the outcome you hoped for. You were not wrong to understand it. You were not wrong to know that the silence was not emptiness on their end. The connection was real, and its absence is felt, and time does not let that go quietly in a person who genuinely let you in. And time was working on you, not in service of the return, not as preparation for the moment they resurface, for you, for the life you are building, for the person you are becoming in the absence of the dynamic that was consuming you, for the gradual, unglamorous, deeply real process of finding out who you are when you are not organized around someone else's unavailability. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and holding both, without letting the one about them collapse the one about you, without letting the hope of their reckoning become the reason you defer the work of your own. That is the whole practice. That is what everything in this has been pointing toward. The avoidance reckoning belongs to them. You cannot access it, cannot accelerate it, cannot position yourself optimally for it without betraying the growth that makes you worth returning to in the first place. It will unfold according to its own internal logic, on its own timeline completely outside your control. Your life belongs to you, every day of it, every hour of the silence, every small choice about where your attention goes and what you invest in, and who you allow close, and how you treat the person you are when nobody who matters is watching. That is yours, completely and only yours. And no amount of waiting, no quality of patience, no depth of understanding of avoidant attachment psychology is a substitute for the simple, difficult daily act of living it. The longer they go without you, the more it hurts them. That is true. And the longer you go fully invested in your own life, not waiting, not positioning, not managing the hope, the more it builds you. That is truer. That is the whole thing. Right there. Build.